On the 10th of May 1945, Okinawa, a combat cameraman recorded something so tragic that even today it's difficult to watch. An upturned Sherman tank engulfed in flames, its crew fighting for their lives as fellow Marines struggled to save them. For years we've seen this footage, but almost no one knows the story behind it. Who were the men in that tank? Who was the man behind the camera? And what really happened in those final desperate moments? Join us in this video as after 80 years we unravel the mystery behind the scene known as Death of a Tank. To really understand what took place, we need to go back to early May 1945 as the battle for Okinawa was entering its bloodiest phase. Amongst the flamethrower men and demolitions expert battling across the island's labyrinth of caves and defensive positions were a far smaller but equally courageous group who risked life and limb on a daily basis to capture frontline footage for the newsreels back home. Amongst them was this man, Corporal Walter Spangler. Raised in Vallejo, California, Walter developed a passion for photography as a teenager, which served him well when in December 1942 he joined the Marine Corps. Earning a coveted place as a combat cameraman, he eventually found himself in the Pacific and, by April 1945, was right here on Okinawa. Day after day he went out with his 16mm Bell and Howell Automaster, often with early colour film, capturing men advancing cave by cave as they cleared out the island's die-hard defenders. Always looking for action and the most dramatic shots, it's no surprise that Spangler gravitated towards the armour of the 6th Tank Battalion. Commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Denig, the 6th had landed on the island on the 1st of April and since then had been heavily involved in the southward drive. Fortunately for us, Denig's formation employed their own unique identification markers, which allows us to follow them with precise detail. In this famous image, we see a Sherman tank on the day of the initial landing, laden with troops, moving along a typical Okinawan road. Note this identification mark on the hull. It's important, as records tell us that the battalion's 3 companies each used a different colour for unit markings, with Company A under Captain Philip Morrell using yellow, B led by Captain Robert Hall white, and Captain Hugh Corrigan's C red. Within each company, the 4 fighting platoons took on a specific shape marker, with a square indicating 1st platoon, a circle 2nd, 3rd using a diamond and 4th a triangle. Within each of those platoons, a number identified the specific tank, 1, 2 or 3. And so, this colour footage right here shows the tanks of Company B's 1st platoon in action with Square 2 advancing on screen. Let's take a closer look at one of those tanks. This is the M4A3 Sherman. With decent armour, a reliable petrol-powered V8 engine and 75mm main gun, it offered a good balance of firepower, speed and protection. The A3 had a crew of 5, with the driver and his assistant located here in the forward part of the tank's hull, each with their own access hatch. On the left side of the turret beneath this hatch was located the tank's loader, on the right just here the commander, and beneath and forward of him was the gunner. In the case of emergency, there was a hull escape hatch located here beneath the assistant driver's seat from which the crew could exit beneath the tank. All told, the Sherman was a good, reliable asset in the Pacific campaign. Good, but certainly not indestructible. Not only were anti-tank guns a constant danger on the battlefield, but there was the very real risk presented by mines. Far harder to defend against and present in their thousands on Okinawa, they came in several forms, from the hated terracotta mines metal detectors couldn't pick up, to dedicated anti-tank mines, and even much larger adapted aerial bombs which could devastate anything on the battlefield. So, by the 6th of May, the notorious Maeda Escarpment, known better today as Hacksaw Ridge, had been cleared and the general advance went on, with the 6th Marine Division pushing along Okinawa's west coast towards the city of Naha. Unsurprisingly, Corporal Spangler was on the ground throughout that time, capturing these scenes of the intense fighting that went on to clear out the stubborn defenders from well-entrenched positions. Late on the 9th, the 22nd Marine Regiment learned that they were once again going into action, and that the following morning 6th Tank's Baker Company would join them, to be called up to deal with Japanese strongpoints when needed. Assigned as the lead support were Lieutenant Jennings' 1st Platoon, with Square 1, 2 and 3 on point. Also coming along was Walter Spangler, who would record the events. By exploring the photographic archives and material related to that campaign, we can understand their route a little better. Today, the area in which they operated has been heavily urbanised, and what was once fields is now covered with housing. But by exploring this wartime aerial image and matching it up with the modern view, we can understand what it looked like at the time. Key here in aligning the photograph are the Makinato airport site, still identifiable, the Maeda escarpment, the Asakawa River and its bridge just here. By layering one image over the other and zooming in on this area, taking this rock shelf as a geographical reference point, we find the village of Jichaku and the Asakawa, on the far side of which the Japanese had established a strong defensive line. It was this position the 22nd Marines and the tanks of Company B were to assault. In fact, that assault did start well, with the 22nd gaining a foothold on the southern bank before dawn, but as the last of A Company crossed the temporary footbridge constructed near the main but unusable bridge here, two Japanese soldiers with satchel charges were seen to burst out of cover. In moments they'd blown themselves and the bridge into oblivion, separating the Marines from their armour support. Knowing that they were desperately needed, Captain Hall, whose force was just south of Jichaku, ordered his tanks to turn eastwards in hopes of finding a fordable position further downstream. Today, identifying the exact route they took is extremely difficult, largely due to urbanisation, but by exploring the overlaid wartime aerial, we can get some idea. We know that Captain Hall's tanks were aiming for the riverbank section about here, and that he needed to move quickly, but couldn't simply advance along the north bank due to enemy fire on its far side. The most logical route, which maintained reasonable safety, was this one, skirting the village of Uchima before moving south to the Asakawa. Corporal Spangler in his footage notes of that day refers to the force moving down a draw or wide valley. We can't be 100% certain, but after literally hours of exploring all nearby topographical features, this area offers the best potential match to Spangler's footage. Here we see a draw, with a track curving slightly to the right running into the distance, in which can be seen a line of low hills with what looks like a valley running to both left and right, forming a rough T-shape. Here is a prominent rocky outcrop which blocks any view of high ground beyond. To capture these shots, Spangler has taken up a position on some kind of raised high ground to look down the valley. In the footage, a stretcher party brings a wounded Marine across in front of the screen who Spangler tracks as they pass close by. Yet another casualty in a constant battle of attrition. Flipping back to this aerial shot, we can identify a piece of high ground, the same curving track, the rocky outcrop on the right, and a north-south running valley in the distance with low hills beyond. Added to that, we know his unit's destination, which is off-screen here to the south. So could this be the very spot where Spangler caught that film, with this approximate view down the valley? Maybe. Here we see 1st Platoon Shermans engaging several spider holes with 75mm fire at point-blank range before the infantry move in, placing satchel charges into a tunnel entrance with the resulting explosion caught on film. Inspecting the damage with understandable caution, 3 men in shot duck in unison as gunfire is heard nearby. Moving on, Company B with the attached infantry and Spangler presumably then prepared to make a southwards turn into this open area leading to the river. Eyewitness testimony tells us that shortly after 1:15, Company B's tanks, which until now had been travelling in column to minimise the ever-present danger of mines, came to a halt in about this area, as ahead of them, Marine engineers worked with mine detectors to clear safe lanes through which the armour could move. Taking advantage of that pause, most crews jumped out to get some fresh air after a confined morning amongst the ever-present petrol fumes. It was only a short break though, as a few minutes later, with the area supposedly cleared, the order came to mount up, with Square 3's driver climbing back aboard, noting the crew of Square 2 directly to his front doing the same. Firing up their 450 horsepower Ford V8s, the leading tanks rolled out, with Spangler filming. Moments later, and just out of shot, a shattering explosion rent the air, with Square 2, according to witnesses, doing a complete front flip before slamming down, turret first, into the earth, leaving a huge pall of black smoke rising skywards. Less than a minute later, Spangler, rushing to get into position to capture the scene, began to film, recording what may well be the most powerful footage of the entire Pacific War. Let's understand exactly what we saw here. The scene, which starts at 2 minutes 39 seconds into Spangler's reel, shows an upturned Square 2, already well alight, with flames pouring from the engine bay area at the rear of the tank, and a number of Marines in shot, one using a fire extinguisher and one brave man actually on the tank, striking the forward part of the hull with some kind of heavy metal object, presumably in an attempt to open the lower escape hatch, behind which at least 2 men could be heard shouting. What's not captured on film here, but is visible in this still, are the moments before, where Square 3 had driven up, the commander racing over to attach a towing cable to the hull to use their own tank to drag Square 2 back over onto her tracks. That cable, visible here, had quickly snapped under the massive strain. At the same time, the crews of each tank nearby had grabbed their own fire extinguishers and, despite the very real risk of explosion, converged on Square 2. That's what we see here. Tankers trying vainly to fight back flames as another man appears on screen with a shovel and begins trying to dig an access space to the driver's hatch in the hull where 3 men in indescribable conditions remain trapped. At 3:25 in Spangler's film, he cuts away to focus on a dazed man in a t-shirt with blood pouring from his left arm, who staggers towards the tank and rescuers. It's clear that he's been involved somehow. Spotting him, one of the Marines close to the tank with extinguisher in hand looks up, clearly recognizing him, and he and another man walk over as the wounded man simply looks on. A consoling hand on the back is all we see before the camera cuts back to the flaming tank. In the following seconds, now with a different angle, a group of men are seen watching on as 2, one in a light t-shirt, make a last effort to access the hull. It's only a glimpse, but with one final hit, it appears that he succeeds and then opens the hatch outwards. The camera cuts at this point, and our next shot shows the same location, minus the man who has opened it, but the volume of smoke pouring out of the access hatch just here confirms the inevitable. It's too late. The crew within have perished. With nothing left to do, a small group watch on for a few more seconds, wiping away sweat and then resignedly back away from the blazing wreck. The next cut, tragically ironic given what has just happened, shows a Marine minesweeper in the foreground looking for other undetonated charges, as a small knot of men in the background look on helplessly at a blazing Square 2. At 4:06 on Spangler's film, the fire reaches the tank's ammunition and a huge explosion ends any glimmer of hope as the Sherman bursts into pieces in a blast that must have been heard for miles around. But where exactly did those events take place? Again, we can't be absolutely certain, but knowing the start point, the destination, and the likely route brings us to this area, the meeting between these 2 draws, and on the approaches to the Asakawa. Several clips from Spangler's footage offer clues. The camera starts to the left and sees tanks turning to their right into another piece of open ground. Those hills in the background offer clues too. They include this double-lobed one just here, not far from Square 2. Beyond them, the ground slopes down into a lower saddle, behind which, in the distance, can be seen further high ground running away obliquely from the camera. Importantly, there's also a low shelf at the base of those hills, which stops just about the point where Square 2 met her end. In fact, this incident is remarkably well documented with imagery, and a whole series of stills exist showing the event and surrounding terrain. Like this one, taken some time after the explosion of the ammunition, at a distance and from some kind of grassy bank on the far side of a valley. Then there's several taken 4 days later on the 14th of May, when a salvage team returned to the tank. Note the hill in the background here when looking at the burnt out wreck from the rear left. Now I've looked all over the entire area at hundreds of angles, and only this one offers a good match. Admittedly, it's not easy to see, but there's a double-lobed shape to this hill, with a slope down into a low saddle just here, high ground beyond, and what looks to me at least like a shelf-like projection running to its front just here. More importantly, historically it makes sense. This is the exact location Square 2 would have passed had it gone down the first valley as we showed, turned right, which we saw, and then continued along the route that led to the river. So was it in this very location, now in the heart of a residential district in Okinawa, that this famous incident took place? I think so, but tell us what you think in the comments. But what actually happened to Square 2? The 6th Tank Battalion Special Action Report covering the period simply states, during this forward displacement, the 2nd tank in column was completely destroyed by an undetected mine. Later investigation apparently found that the mine was in fact a pair of 500-pound high-explosive aerial bombs that had been dug into the ground and triggered by a pressure plate narrowly missed by Square 1. That explosion had resulted in the catastrophic damage to Square 2, including warping of the hull escape hatch so as to make it unusable. This footage, taken on the island at that time, shows a similar mine, another aircraft bomb, being dug out from the ground having been detected. For whatever reason, the one that Square 2 hit was not. And what about that bleeding and dazed man in the film? Eyewitness reports provide the answer. He was in fact one of the crew, 19-year-old Private Billy Bledsoe from Campbell, Missouri, Square 2's loader, whose position in the front left of the Sherman's turret had seen him thrown clear as the tank somersaulted. Despite clearly being in shock in the footage, Bledsoe escaped the awful fate of his crewmates with only a fractured left elbow. One other man, the tank's commander, miraculously survived. Corporal Paul Durham, a 22-year-old native of Stella, Missouri, who had also been thrown clear of the tank in the initial blast. And what, for me at least, makes this already powerful scene even more so is the knowledge that Durham is very likely this man, seen amidst the flames on top of the burning tank. Not a stranger trying to rescue another, but a tank commander trying to rescue his crew. Terribly burned, Durham was taken away to a field hospital where it was believed his injuries were too severe to be survivable. Incredibly, he did live, though both he and Bledsoe, despite being in the same hospital ward, had no idea that any of the other crew had got out. And what of those 3 men who never did? Marine Corps casualty cards for the Second World War provide the answer. They were Corporal Don Mason, the tank's 21-year-old gunner, raised in Fort Worth, Texas. He had served in the infantry with the 4th Marines on Saipan and Guam before transferring to the 6th Tanks. Corporal Benjamin Benny Woodall, Square 2's driver, just 19 years of age at the time of his death. He had moved around several states in his childhood, eventually settling in California and marrying a Violet Cooper shortly before joining the Marine Corps in October 1943. And PFC Earl Anderson, also 19 and raised in Illinois and Iowa, the assistant driver and a veteran of the Guam campaign. Despite his young age, he left behind a wife Verna and an infant son, Dennis. Understandably, given the ferocity of the blaze and the subsequent explosion, no identifiable remains were ever recovered, and only Benny Woodall's identity disc confirmed that the burned-out tank found by a Graves registration unit in November 1945 was the wreck of Square 2. The collective remains of the 3 men were buried in Okinawa Command Cemetery as unknowns, and eventually, in 1949, were repatriated to the States to be buried in one communal grave at Fort McPherson National Cemetery in Nebraska, where they remain together to this day. And that's the thing that's often forgotten about stories like this. The tank Square 2 isn't, somewhat understandably, the one which today many people recognise. But the real story is not of the tank, but the men who crewed it, who risked and ultimately gave their lives on the long road to victory. Thanks for watching. This was a tough video to make, and we'd like to acknowledge a 2024 article in Leatherneck magazine also investigating the fate of Square 2, which adds much to our understanding of the story. Finally, if you find content like this interesting, why not check out World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, our dedicated podcast where our hosts, Professor Matthias Strone and Jesse Alexander, recently explored the story of prisoners of war in the Pacific Theatre from both the Allied and Axis perspectives. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.